Okay, so the next modifier we're going to cover is the Boolean modifier. And the Boolean modifier essentially is a way that we can programmatically combine the data of two objects that would otherwise be too complicated to do manually. So let me show you what this means. So, see, I was testing it before. So I just have a default cube here. So to use a Boolean modifier, we need at least two objects. So let's add another object. Mesh, let's add a cone. And I'm just going to move it sort of right here so you can see what this does. So we're going to add our Boolean modifier to the cube object. So under the modifier properties panel, we're just going to click add modifier. And under generate, we're going to hit Boolean. Okay, so right now, this isn't actually doing anything. And that's because we haven't told this Boolean modifier what is the second object we're going to use to combine this data. So all we have to do is fill out this object tab here. We can click on it and select from the drop down every other object in your scene will appear here. I only have one other object in my scene, so it just says cone. So you can either do it by dropping down or by clicking this eyedropper icon and selecting the second object. So now this Boolean modifier is working, and we can kind of see it because we see that the outline around our cube has changed. So let's hide this cone object by pressing H, and now we can see that the Boolean modifier has used the information of the section of the cone that was overlapping into this cube mesh, and it has cut in. Now this is because by default Boolean is set to difference, and there's a couple different options here for how we want to combine this data. So difference just means that it will look at this Boolean mesh, look at the object you're using as the object in your Boolean modifier, and it is going to look at all the places where they overlap, and it is going to cut into your original object, your cube object, the one that has the modifier on it. It is going to use this object and cut into it wherever it is overlapping. So this will not remove the second object. You will have to hide it. And if you were to move this object around, the Boolean would change. So now if I hide this cone, you'll see the cut has been made there where it was overlapping. There are a couple of different Boolean types. Difference is the default. It's the most commonly used one, at least in my case. This is the one I use the most. We can also join these two objects together by using union. So now we see our cone again, but this actually is not the original cone piece. Our cone piece is still hidden, but it has taken all of the parts of the cone and joined them to this cube. So now this is one object. And if we were to apply this, the geometry would be cut as such. Let's just Control Z to undo that until we get our modifier back, so that way we know our cube underneath these modifiers is still the default cube. Again, if we take the cone and move it around, it will change the Boolean, and we're getting this Z fighting only because we have a cone object, but because this is set to union, it is creating that exact geometry right underneath it, which will go away if you just hide the cone, the separate cone object. Now there's also intersect, which, let's change this over to intersect. So now all this is done, and let's hide our cone. So this is now our cube object. What intersect does is it looks at all the parts that were overlapping between your two objects, and instead of cutting those away, it keeps only those parts. So you can sort of think of it as the inverse of the difference if that helps. So let's move this down so we can see it. So when this is set to difference, if we hide this cone, it cuts away everything that is overlapping and leaves the rest. But if we set it to intersect, it cuts away all the rest and just leaves the part that was overlapping. Now there's a couple of solver options and algorithms that Blender uses to calculate how these cuts and joins and things are going to be made. There's fast and there's exact. It depends sort of on your object, which one of these is going to be more accurate. So I think it defaults to exact, but if you are trying to run a Boolean operation and it's not cutting the way you want it, you can always try fast, and sometimes that will help it. So I use Booleans primarily I use primarily the difference operation, and I use it a lot for cutting in like doorways and windows into wall pieces, which we've shown in demonstrations. There's a couple ways to do it, but the way that I would actually do it, if I were working on something, is with a Boolean. So let's say that this is our wall piece. We would just need to come into orthographic view here in object mode. Let's add a new cube. And let's say this is going to be our door. Scale that in. So this is obviously not to scale, but let's say that this is your wall and this is the door you want cut through it. So we're just going to, the Y scale in this case does not matter as much. I just need to make sure that it is protruding all the way through if I want to make that cut all the way through the mesh. So on the wall piece, we are going to add a Boolean operator. It's defaulted at difference, so we don't need to change any of these settings. And I'm just going to grab the eyedropper and select our door. So now when I hide this door cutter object, we now have a doorway cut really neatly into this mesh. Now you can also use the Boolean operator to cut indents, not just holes. All you would have to do was take your cutting object and make sure that it is not protruding all the way through the mesh. So now I still have my Boolean operator active. So now when I hide this object, you'll see that it's cutting an indent, but not a hole. Now the Boolean modifier isn't perfect. If you have a lot of subdivisions or kind of crazy geometry, it may not be able to calculate the Boolean quite so cleanly, and that is when you might need to change your solver method. But that being said, if you have really wacky edges going on here, it still might not be able to calculate it. So the best way to avoid that, in my experience, is to just not have any of these edges of your cutting object fall along any actual cut edges into your mesh. And what I mean by that, now this is pretty simplistic, so it probably won't cause too many issues, but if this was, a more complicated piece, having an edge cut in your main object that kind of falls right on one of these edges can just cause some issues with calculating the Boolean. Again, you're not seeing it here. These pieces are too simple, but if you're modeling your own piece and you notice that, things just aren't cutting properly, it might be worth it to go into your main object that you want to cut into and clean up the geometry a little bit. So just know that it's not a totally perfect system, as with most things in Blender and other 3D modeling programs. It kind of requires a knowledge of how to make things cleanly, as well as using the modifiers and the tools. So that is it for the Boolean operator, the Boolean modifier, I should say. In the next video, we're going to go over one more in this sort of beginning section. Obviously, there's a lot more modifiers. You can go over them. You can play with them on your own time. We're going to be going over one more as sort of just these are the most important modifiers, and in a later section of the course, we'll cover some of the more advanced ones. So that is it for Boolean. We're going to cover array in the next video.